Weston leaned back in his office chair, staring at the hiring reports spread across his desk. Complaints about staff shortages kept piling up, but what really caught his attention was the high turnover rate. People barely lasted 2 months. Every time he asked his district manager, he got the same answer: "We just can't find the right people." That didn't sit right with him. His father had built this chain of family-style restaurants from the ground up, and when Weston inherited it, he swore to keep the values intact. But something was off. Good workers didn't just vanish. That's when he made his decision. There was a hiring event happening at one of their busiest locations. Instead of sitting back and reviewing reports, he would show up in disguise as an applicant. If something was wrong in the hiring process, he'd see it himself. The next morning, Weston stood in front of the restaurant, unrecognizable. His usual tailored suit was replaced with a wrinkled polo and jeans. He wore thick-rimmed glasses, a cheap watch, and a slightly scruffy beard. Most of the managers only knew him from company-wide emails and the occasional video update. He had never personally met the hiring manager here, so there was no reason for anyone to suspect him. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. The waiting area was packed with people. Some were dressed in their best outfits, nervously tapping their feet. Others looked more casual but hopeful. He spotted a young woman clutching a folder of resumes so tightly her knuckles were white. Behind the counter, a man in his mid-40s leaned back in a chair, flipping through a clipboard. His name tag read Glenn, and from the way he sighed every few seconds, he clearly didn't want to be here. "All right, listen up," Glenn called out, barely looking at the applicants. "If you don't have open availability, just leave now. We don't do special schedules. No excuses." A few people exchanged uneasy glances. One man hesitated before slowly getting up and walking out. Weston frowned. That was a terrible way to start. What if someone had school or another job? Were they really turning away good workers just because they couldn't be here every single hour of the week? One by one, Glenn called people up for interviews. Weston watched carefully, taking note of how the process went. The first applicant was a young man in his early 20s. "So, tell me about yourself," Glenn muttered, not even making eye contact. The guy nervously cleared his throat. "Well, I worked at a cafe before and Cafe work is nothing like this," Glenn interrupted. "This place is fast-paced. You think you can handle that?" The guy blinked. I think so?" Glenn let out a loud sigh. "Yeah, no. Not confident enough." "Next." Weston clenched his jaw. That was it? No follow-up questions, no real conversation. Just dismissed like that? The next applicant was a woman in her 30s. She had a warm smile and carried herself with confidence. "I've worked in food service for over 7 years," she started. "I love working with customers and training new team members." Glenn finally looked up. 7 years? Why'd you leave your last job?" She hesitated. "I had a baby and took some time off." Glenn scoffed. "So, you're rusty. You probably lost your speed." "Sorry, we need people who can keep up." Weston's hands curled into fists. That was blatant discrimination. The woman's face fell. "I can assure you, Next, Glenn said, waving her off. Weston's blood boiled. How many good employees had they lost because of this man's arrogance? Then it was his turn. He sat down across from Glenn, who barely glanced at him. "Name?" "Wes Carter," Weston said smoothly, using the fake identity he had prepared. Glenn scribbled it down. "Experience?" "I worked in retail for a few years," Weston said. "I'm a fast learner." Glenn snorted. "Retail?" "Yeah, that's not gonna cut it." He flipped the page on his clipboard. "Listen, we need people who already know what they're doing. We don't have time to babysit." Weston forced himself to stay calm. "But I'm willing to." "Not a good fit," Glenn said, standing up. "We're done here." Weston stared at him. That was it? No questions about his work ethic? No chance to prove himself? As he stood and walked out, he noticed the woman from earlier still sitting in the parking lot, looking defeated. He wasn't just angry anymore, he was furious. This wasn't just an issue with hiring. Glenn was actively pushing away good workers for petty reasons. And if this was happening here, how many other locations were dealing with the same problem? Weston had seen enough. Glenn had no idea, but his time as hiring manager was about to come to an abrupt end. Weston sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel. The hiring process had been worse than he imagined. Glenn wasn't just dismissive, he was actively sabotaging the company's ability to bring in good workers. That explained the high turnover rate. If this was how people were being treated before they even got a paycheck, how bad was it once they were hired? He needed to go deeper. A few minutes later, he pulled out his phone and searched the restaurant's job listings. Sure enough, they were still hiring. He scrolled through the postings and found one for a kitchen assistant, a back-of-house position with minimal interaction with customers. That was ideal. It would keep him out of the spotlight while he observed what was going on inside. By the time he returned to the restaurant the next day, he had received an automated message confirming his start date. No interview, no onboarding, just a basic "show up at this time" message. That alone was a red flag. No wonder turnover was so high. There was no real screening process beyond Glenn's arbitrary decisions. Inside the kitchen, the air was thick with the smell of sizzling oil and fresh bread. The place was chaotic, staff moving at a frantic pace, the clatter of dishes and the constant shouting of orders. He spotted a man in his early 50s wearing a grease-stained apron and a name tag that read Doug. From the way he was giving instructions, he seemed to be in charge. Doug glanced at Weston. "You the new guy?" Weston nodded. "Yeah, I'm Wes." Doug let out a short breath. "Figures. We go through new hires like napkins. Grab an apron. You're on dish duty." Weston did as he was told and stepped into the dishwashing station. The sink was piled high with plates, and the industrial dishwasher looked like it hadn't been properly cleaned in weeks. As he rolled up his sleeves and got to work, he kept an ear out for what was happening around him. A younger worker, barely out of high school, was struggling to keep up with the grill. Doug barked at him to move faster, but the kid's hands were shaking as he flipped overcooked patties. "I am trying," the kid stammered. "Try harder," Doug snapped. "We don't have time for screw-ups." Weston frowned. That wasn't coaching, that was intimidation. He turned his attention to another worker, a woman in her 40s who moved efficiently between the fryer and the prep station. She worked fast, but there was tension in her posture. "Hey," Weston said quietly as she passed by. "Is it always like this?" She barely spared him a glance. "Worse, usually." Before he could ask more, Doug shouted across the kitchen. "Everyone, listen up. We're short-staffed again, so don't even think about taking your break. You eat when the rush is over." Weston's jaw tightened. That wasn't just unfair, it was illegal. Employees were entitled to breaks, especially in a high-stress environment like this. The next few hours were a blur of sweat and exhaustion. Weston worked harder than he had in years, scrubbing dishes, taking out trash, and even stepping in to help with food prep. The staff was overworked, but they pushed through without complaint. It wasn't a lack of effort that was causing problems, it was a lack of leadership. As the dinner rush slowed, Weston overheard a conversation between two employees near the walk-in refrigerator. "I swear I'm done," one of them muttered. "I can't take another shift like this." "Yeah, but where else are you gonna go?" the other replied. "They know we need the job. That's why they treat us like this." Weston's stomach turned. This wasn't just a bad shift, this was a pattern. He had seen enough. He stepped out of the kitchen, making his way toward the manager's office. Glenn was inside, feet propped up on the desk, scrolling through his phone. Weston knocked once before stepping in. Glenn barely looked up. "What do you want?" Weston shut the door behind him. "We need to talk." Glenn sighed, setting his phone down. "Look, if you're about to complain about your shift, save it. This job is tough. If you can't handle it, there's the door." Weston folded his arms. "Actually, I'm here to talk about the hiring process and the way this place is run." Glenn let out a short laugh. "Oh, you're one of those. Look, kid, I've been doing this for years. We hire fast, we move fast. If people can't keep up, that's not my problem." Weston took a slow breath. "You're turning away good workers for the wrong reasons. And the ones who do get hired? They're quitting because they're being treated like machines." Glenn rolled his eyes. "That's how this business works. You think people stick around in restaurants because they love it? No, they stay if they need the paycheck, and if they don't, they leave. That's just how it goes." Weston's hands curled into fists. He had heard enough. He reached up and took off his glasses, shaking off the disguise. Glenn's expression shifted from irritation to confusion, and then to sheer panic. Weston met his gaze, his voice calm but firm. "I own this company, Glenn, and I just spent the last 2 days watching you run it into the ground." Glenn's face drained of color. His usual arrogance evaporated as he scrambled to process what was happening. Weston leaned against the desk, watching the man squirm. The hiring manager had spent the past 2 days dismissing people without a second thought. But now, faced with the owner of the company, he suddenly had nothing to say. Weston let the silence stretch, giving Glenn a chance to absorb the gravity of the situation. The man shifted uncomfortably, his hands gripping the edge of the desk as if it could anchor him. Finally, Glenn swallowed hard and forced out a weak laugh. "All right, you got me. I didn't recognize you. Clever move, boss." Weston didn't blink. "I didn't do this for theatrics, Glenn. I did it because I needed to see firsthand why we're losing employees. And now I know." Glenn straightened up, trying to salvage control. "Look, I admit I run a tight ship. But that's what keeps things moving. If I hired every nervous wreck that walked in here, we'd be even more short-staffed when they quit a week later." Weston shook his head. "You're not filtering out bad hires. You're driving away the people who actually want to work here. I saw you dismiss multiple qualified applicants without giving them a real chance. And the people you do hire? You throw them into the job with zero support, then act shocked when they don't last." Glenn's jaw tensed. "That's just how this industry works. People come and go." Weston stepped forward. "People leave bad management, not the industry. And from what I saw in that kitchen, you and Doug have made this one of the worst places to work. No proper training, no respect for people's time, and blatant disregard for labor laws." Glenn's eyes darted toward the door as if looking for an escape. "Doug's tough, but he keeps things running." Weston's voice remained steady. "Doug is running people into the ground. He's forcing employees to skip breaks, pushing them past their limits, and creating a miserable environment. And you're enabling it by making sure only the most desperate people get hired." Glenn's mouth opened, then closed. He had no defense. Weston took a step back and crossed his arms. "Effective immediately, you're done here." Glenn's breath hitched. "Wait. Let's be reasonable. I've been with this company for years. I know how things work." Weston's expression didn't waver. "That's the problem. You've been here long enough to know better, but instead of improving things, you made them worse." Glenn exhaled sharply, his bravado completely gone. "You're making a mistake." Weston shook his head. "No. The mistake was letting people like you run this place unchecked." Glenn's shoulders sagged. He knew there was no talking his way out of this. Without another word, he grabbed his things and left. Weston took a moment to collect himself before heading back to the kitchen. The staff barely noticed him at first, too exhausted to pay attention to anything outside their immediate tasks. Doug was barking orders at the grill cook again, his voice sharp and impatient. Weston walked straight up to him. "We need to talk." Doug turned, clearly annoyed at being interrupted. "Who the hell?" His words caught in his throat as recognition set in. Weston didn't give him time to recover. "I've been working here for 2 days, and what I've seen is unacceptable. You're running this kitchen through fear, not leadership. That ends now." Doug's stance stiffened. "This is a tough job. If people can't handle the pressure, they don't belong here." Weston tilted his head slightly. "I watched you berate a kid who was trying his best. I saw you deny workers their legally required breaks. That's not pressure, that's abuse." Doug's face darkened. "You don't understand what it takes to keep a place like this running." Weston's voice remained calm but firm. "What it takes is a team that's supported, trained, and respected. You've created the exact opposite. That's why you're constantly short-staffed. That's why people quit." Doug's lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't argue. He knew Weston was right. Weston exhaled slowly. "You have 2 choices. Either you change the way you manage this kitchen or you leave with Glenn." Doug's shoulders sagged slightly. "And if I say I can change?" Weston studied him for a moment. "Then you'll get one chance to prove it. But if I hear about one more skipped break, one more employee being pushed to the point of quitting, you're gone." Doug nodded stiffly. Weston turned to the staff. "Starting today, things are changing. You will get proper training. You will be treated with respect. And if anyone in management makes you feel otherwise, you come directly to me." For the first time since he stepped into that kitchen, the tension in the air lessened. The employees exchanged uncertain glances as if unsure whether to believe him. One of the cooks hesitated before speaking. "Does that mean we actually get breaks now?" Weston nodded. "Yes. And fair wages. And better hiring practices." A slow murmur spread through the team. Some looked relieved, others skeptical. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but this was the first step. Weston turned back to Doug. "You have a lot of work to do. I suggest you start now." Doug gave a curt nod and turned back to the grill, but there was a noticeable shift in his demeanor. The bark in his voice was gone. As Weston stepped out of the kitchen, he pulled out his phone and made a call. There was a lot more work to be done, and it started with overhauling the hiring process across every location. This wasn't just about fixing one restaurant. It was about making sure this never happened again. Weston wasted no time. The moment he stepped out of the kitchen, he was already dialing his corporate operations director. His tone was direct: changes needed to happen immediately. He ordered a full audit of hiring practices across every location, a review of management conduct, and an anonymous survey for employees to report workplace conditions without fear of retaliation. By the next morning, he was back at the restaurant, this time without the disguise. Word had spread fast: Glenn was gone, and Doug had been given a final warning. Employees eyed him cautiously, unsure what his presence meant for them. Some still seemed skeptical, as if waiting for things to go back to the way they were. Weston understood their hesitation. Promises didn't mean much without action. Instead of calling a formal meeting, he chose to observe. He stationed himself in a corner of the dining area, watching how the staff interacted now that they knew he was there. The pace was still hectic, but something had shifted. Doug wasn't barking orders. Instead, he was giving clear instructions, correcting mistakes without hostility. The younger cook who had struggled the day before seemed more at ease, moving with better rhythm. A veteran employee who had barely spoken before was now taking the lead in organizing prep work. The tension that had once gripped the kitchen had loosened, though it wasn't completely gone. Weston approached one of the cashiers, a woman in her 20s with tired eyes but a welcoming smile. He asked about her experience working here. She hesitated before answering, clearly weighing whether or not she could be honest. She admitted that the pay was decent, but unreliable schedules changed at the last minute, and overtime was often expected but rarely rewarded. She mentioned how some employees had to fight just to get their paychecks on time. That was unacceptable. Weston made a note to investigate payroll inconsistencies. If employees weren't getting paid fairly, that was another failure in leadership that needed fixing. He moved to the kitchen and struck up a conversation with the woman who had been denied a job during the hiring event. He had personally reached out and offered her a second chance. She was now training as a line cook, and within minutes of speaking to her, it was clear she had the experience and work ethic Glenn had dismissed so easily. She admitted she almost didn't take the offer, assuming nothing would change. But after hearing that Glenn had been fired, she decided to give it a shot. Weston told her that accountability was just the beginning. Better scheduling, clearer career paths, and stronger leadership were next on the list. In the following days, Weston implemented a full hiring overhaul. Managers were retrained on fair hiring practices, ensuring candidates were judged on qualifications, not personal biases. New hires received proper onboarding, with clear expectations and real training instead of being thrown into chaos. Doug's management style remained under close scrutiny. While he had toned down his intimidation tactics, Weston knew that real change took time. If Doug couldn't maintain a respectful environment, he'd be replaced. Weston wasn't making empty threats, he was restructuring the company from the inside out. One of the most important changes came at the corporate level. Weston introduced an initiative that allowed employees to submit concerns directly to headquarters, bypassing managers who might otherwise ignore them. A rotating team of executives, including Weston himself, would visit locations unannounced to experience firsthand what employees faced daily. Weeks passed, and the results spoke for themselves. Employee retention improved. Customer satisfaction increased as service became smoother. The kitchen ran more efficiently, not because people were scared into working harder, but because they finally had the support they needed. One afternoon, Weston returned to the restaurant once more, this time blending into the background. He watched as the woman who had once been rejected by Glenn trained a new hire with patience and encouragement. The younger cook who had struggled before now worked confidently, no longer flinching at every instruction. Doug caught sight of Weston and gave a small nod, acknowledgement but also understanding. He knew the expectations were permanent. Weston left feeling something he hadn't in a long time: certainty. Change wasn't just possible, it was happening. Weston sat in his office reviewing the latest reports. The numbers were shifting in the right direction. Turnover had slowed and customer satisfaction was improving. But he wasn't looking for numbers alone. He wanted to see proof of real change, something that couldn't be captured in a spreadsheet. The anonymous employee feedback system had been in place for a month now, and the submissions painted a complicated picture. While many employees appreciated the changes, there were still lingering issues at certain locations. Some managers resisted new policies, claiming the old ways were faster. Others were reluctant to adjust scheduling practices, still treating workers as disposable. One report stood out. It came from an employee at another location, describing eerily similar issues to what he had uncovered before. Managers dismissing applicants without real consideration, employees being pressured to work beyond their scheduled hours, and a culture of fear keeping people from speaking up. Weston sighed, rubbing his temples. Firing Glenn had sent a message, but it hadn't wiped out the problem entirely. If this was happening elsewhere, it meant toxic leadership had taken root deeper than he'd thought. He decided to pay a visit. Arriving unannounced, he walked into one of the company's older locations. The place had a different atmosphere than the last restaurant he'd investigated, but not in a good way. The workers moved efficiently, but there was no energy, no engagement. It was as if they were just going through the motions, doing the bare minimum to get through their shifts. At the counter, a young man worked the register with a forced smile, his eyes darting toward the manager standing nearby. Weston recognized that kind of tension. It wasn't the pressure of a busy shift, it was the presence of someone watching too closely, waiting for mistakes. He moved toward the back, where the kitchen staff worked in near silence. Orders were being completed, but there was no camaraderie, no sense of teamwork. At another restaurant, he had seen cooks joking between rushes, helping each other out. Here, everyone kept their heads down. Weston spotted the manager, a tall man with a stiff posture, arms crossed as he scanned the room. He wasn't yelling, but his presence alone was enough to keep everyone on edge. Stepping closer, Weston listened as the manager corrected an employee. There was no shouting, no direct insults, but the man's tone was sharp, leaving no room for discussion. When the worker hesitated, the manager simply turned away, muttering something under his breath. It was a different style than Doug's aggressive approach, but the effect was the same: fear, exhaustion, and a lack of trust. Weston approached the employee who had been corrected. He was a middle-aged man, his uniform neat but his expression weary. Weston asked how long he had been working there, and the man hesitated before answering. Long enough to know that speaking honestly wouldn't end well. Weston reassured him that he wasn't here to punish anyone, he just wanted to understand what was happening. Slowly, the employee opened up. The manager rarely raised his voice, but his expectations were impossible. Mistakes weren't tolerated, and even minor errors led to reduced hours or sudden schedule changes. Any attempt to request time off was met with disapproval. That explained the tension. People weren't just overworked, they were afraid of losing their livelihood. Weston nodded, then turned his attention back to the manager. He observed for a while longer, taking note of every interaction. The problem wasn't chaos like before. It was control. This manager ruled through quiet intimidation, using power to keep employees compliant. Weston had seen enough. He stepped forward, making his presence known. The manager's expression shifted when he recognized him. There was no panic, no immediate backpedaling, just a quiet, calculating look, like someone considering his next move. Weston addressed him directly, asking about the concerns that had been raised. The manager didn't deny them. Instead, he justified his actions, explaining that a strict environment kept things running smoothly. Weston listened, then responded with a firm reminder of the company's values. Efficiency wasn't the goal, sustainability was. Fear-driven management might produce short-term results, but it crushed morale and led to burnout. The manager nodded, saying he understood, but Weston could see the resistance in his eyes. This wasn't someone who would change overnight. The conversation ended with a clear warning: either he adapted to the new leadership approach or he would be replaced. There was no room for compromise. After leaving the restaurant, Weston followed up with his operations team, implementing further checks to ensure managers across all locations were following the new guidelines. He also arranged for leadership training sessions, making it clear that managing through fear, whether loud or quiet, had no place in the company. Weeks later, a follow-up visit confirmed the impact. The manager had adjusted, whether out of genuine change or self-preservation. Weston wasn't entirely sure, but more importantly, the employees seemed less hesitant, more engaged. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Weston knew this wouldn't be the last time he had to step in. Fixing a broken system wasn't about making a single change and walking away. It required constant vigilance, ongoing adjustments, and a willingness to listen. But he was committed, because this company wasn't just about serving meals. It was about people, employees, customers, and the communities they served. And that was worth fighting for.